collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up this week, the Centre for Visual Arts and Research is inaugurated.
We have a 4-floor research centre with over 6,000 books on Cyprus, the Near East, Greece, Turkey and Egypt, and archives. A lot of archival material and masses of old photographs of Cyprus from 1880 to 1950. These items are all open and at the disposal of researchers from abroad, from Cyprus, students, anybody that is interested in the history of Cyprus and the Near East.
High Caesarean section rates can have serious consequences.
There is increase in morbidity to the mother and the baby. The babies tend to have generally less possibility of reacting against antigens, which means they are more allergic conditions.
Stass Paraskos is to be honoured in Leeds.
So Stass in 1966 held an exhibition at the Leeds College of Art, as it happened, and the story goes that a school teacher was taking her pupils around the exhibition, and 2 girls were seen giggling at a painting showing a male nude in a state of excitement. The teacher was absolutely outraged, walked straight round the corner to the police station and asked for this painting to be taken off the walls, which the police duly did.
And we'll find out about Cyprus' role in the First World War.
So in all those sorts of material ways, and there are other ones one could mention, Cyprus was significantly affected by the war.
A new addition to the cultural life in Cyprus was launched by President Anastasiadis recently. It's the Centre for Visual Arts and Research, and it's the brainchild of Rita Severis. Rita, welcome to the Cyprus News Digest. This is a project you've been working on, I think, for some time, and it's one that's very close to your heart.
Indeed, it's like a 4th child. I've been working on it since 2000, hoping to materialize this vision of having a bicommunal centre of arts and research, and finally, 14 years later, it happened. I can't believe it.
It's a big building, it's an old building, and the most important thing perhaps is that it's in the heart of the old town of Nicosia. But you've renovated it, and although the building itself is old and the artefacts inside it are old, it's a very modern space.
Yes, this building used to be an old khan, which was turned into a flour mill in the 50s. We bought it in 2008, a completely ruined, derelict building, but we were enchanted by its position because it's very near the buffer zone, and hopefully one day Ermou will open up, joining Paphos Gate with Famagusta Gate, and then that would be fantastic. We did want to be in the heart of old Nicosia, so we took it up. It was tremendous work. Nobody ever believed that we would reach the stage we're in at now. But here it is, and it does look very, very modern. We tried to put some elements of traditionalism in it, like the gates and like that. We used only copper, stone and wood, the materials from Cyprus. And it opened its gates and is waiting for people to come and embrace it.
People can visit just to see what's here, but what about the research side of this?
We have a 4-floor research centre with over 6,000 books on Cyprus, the Near East, Greece, Turkey and Egypt, and archives. A lot of archival material and masses of old photographs of Cyprus from 1880 to 1950. These items are all open and at the disposal of researchers from abroad, from Cyprus, students, anybody that is interested in the history of Cyprus and the Near East. We have 2 girls in the library that were very willing to help, provide anything they request, and even give advice.
You've managed to collect a lot of this material over the years because you yourself are a historian. When it came to finding things to put into this space, presumably There's a lot more you've got that you couldn't put in here.
Oh,
so what did you choose and why?
I didn't choose, Rosie. Everything came. But what is exhibited, it's 1/3 of it. But what we're thinking of doing is changing, rotating. There are storerooms where we store what is not exhibited. People can look into our storerooms. This is an innovative side of the museum. They can peep into our storeroom, see what there is there, and if they're interested, we can bring it out. And every so often, maybe every 6 months, maybe every 8 months, we intend to rotate things around so people can have a chance to see what is not exhibited at the moment. Furthermore, we do intend to start having thematic exhibitions. For example, Caesarean. Everything related to Caesarean will come out, be exhibited on the ground floor for a month, let's say, or Famagusta, or Paphos, or the bazaars, the caravanserais, the Huns. We will get thematic exhibitions so that people can have a chance to see what's not exhibited.
What about your personal favourite of what's in the collection? Do you have one? It must be so difficult when there's so much.
I was always trying to say, no, I'm objective, I love everything. But deep in my heart, I have the paintings of Keith Henderson. I love his work, and there is one in particular which is called Peristerona, which is so prophetic and so beautiful that I can never stop admiring it.
When is the centre open?
The centre is open from 9:30 to 4:30 daily, including Saturday. And now that the weather is good and people go out on Sundays, we shut. Because they go to the beach, they go to the mountains. In winter, we will shut on Mondays and stay open on Sundays.
Because we should add that you've also got a cafeteria, a gift shop, a bar.
We have a cafeteria, we have a gift shop. The cafeteria stays open till 6:30 every night. And then we have a roof terrace with the most magnificent views of Nicosia, absolutely lovely, where we offer drinks, we offer cheese platters, etc. From October, we'll start offering dinner as well. And we project there photographs continually from 7:30 to midnight. We project continuously photographs from our archives of Cyprus from 1880 to 1950 and old films. So while you're having your drink, you can see an old documentary of the 20s, 30s or 40s of Cyprus and masses of photographs from the albums of those who passed through these years.
It's a wonderful project, Rita. The very best of luck with it, and thanks for telling us about it.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
So Sabaratnam Arulkumaran is Professor Emeritus in Obstetrics and Gynaecology at St George's University of London. He's in Cyprus because he's also started working with St George's Medical School at the University of Nicosia. He is, as we said, an expert in obstetrics and gynaecology. We'll talk in a minute about setting up the department here in the medical school in Nicosia. But first, if you will, I'd like to just ask you a little bit about the story that we've had for years now in the news in Cyprus, that we are among, I think, the highest countries in the world for the rates of Caesarean when it comes to women giving birth. Your comments on that?
Yeah, I think the World Health Organization generally says that we must try and bring down the Caesarean section rate, because with the Caesarean section rate there is increase in morbidity to the mother and the baby. The babies tend to have generally less possibility of reacting against antigens, which means they have more allergic conditions, and they generally promote normal childbirth. Now, the incidence of Caesarean is going higher and higher in most countries. In America, it's about 33%. In Brazil, it's about 40-odd%. In China, it is very high. This seems to be partly related to the number of children the parents like to have, sometimes like in China, 1 child or 2 children. Secondly, it is related to the older age of mothers and assisted reproduction. And thirdly, it may be related to the interaction between the caregiver and the mother. Sometimes the mother wishes to have a cesarean section, or sometimes the obstetrician decides in the best interest to have a cesarean section, which might be for his or her convenience or for financial reasons.
That's the problem, isn't it? Because our attitudes perhaps to childbirth have changed over the last 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
We often hear, are people too posh to push?
Yeah.
Are we actually so blooming busy these days that we like to think that childbirth is something we can arrange to suit ourselves?
Well, interestingly, even in the United States or in the United Kingdom, the incidence of maternal request cesarean section without any medical indications is slowly rising. It is not a phenomenal amount, but it is still rising. At St. George's, where we work, it's 7 to 10% of the total cesarean section.
Why do doctors say fine?
They usually counsel and say that these are the risks and these are the benefits of a elective cesarean section. And if they are convinced that it might be more of a problem to the mother, sometimes they refer the mother to see another obstetrician. Say, for example, the mother is obese, her chance of getting thromboembolism is much higher with a cesarean section. So they try to deter the mother. Many hospitals like St. George's, where I work, we have a midwife, especially running a clinic for counseling women who request cesarean section, because the midwife will talk about pain relief, the fear of leaving the mother alone in labor, and any other concern she has, because one of the conditions which has been mentioned is that when they get older they will have stress urinary incontinence. The studies have not been very convincing, although there is some relationship. Women tend to have incontinence after birth, but they tend to settle down after a few years. So the controversy is like that, and in Brazil they talk about sexual relationship being affected if they have a vaginal birth. So some of the unfounded or not well-proven facts also come into the decision-making by the mother, not only the fear of pain, but also the subsequent consequences on the sexual and urinary system issues.
It's interesting that you mention the effect it can have on the child. That isn't very widely published, is it? Or publicised, should we say, to the general public?
Yes. It is known that from the studies that the incidence of allergy, asthma and similar things...
Which are on an incredible rise across the world.
That's right.
Have we managed to make an association with that?
Yeah, they think that now babies born naturally with normal vaginal birth, they have a less incidence of this problem. The general incidence is rising, might be partly because of more chemicals being used for production of agricultural produce and so on and so forth. That's one side, but in addition there might be something to do, and the explanation given is the baby acquires a certain amount of pathogens or organisms when the baby comes through the natural passages, and that induces what we call as an active immunity. The baby produces antibodies against those antigens.
And then, of course, if it's breastfed, it's got an even better chance.
Yeah.
Let's get back to St. George's Medical School at the University of Nicosia. You're going to be, setting up an obstetrics department there?
The obstetrics and gynaecology is one of the major clinical areas in medicine, and like general medicine or pediatrics and psychiatry and so forth. So I'm here to assist. I'm not here full-time because of my other commitments in the UK. So I'm here just to assist in clinical teaching and in the organizational aspects to see how best we can deliver the teaching both theoretically and clinically.
Get in touch with the Cyprus News Digest by emailing cyprusnewsdigest@gmail.com.
Stass Paraskos is, of course, one of Cyprus' most famous artists, and he passed away earlier this year. With me on the Cyprus News Digest today, we have his son, Michael, who's going to tell us all about a project that's happening in the UK. Stass Paraskos is going to join Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth in a celebration of famous artists. This is happening in Leeds, Michael. What exactly are they going to do?
It's part of an annual festival that's been going a number of years now, where Leeds basically lights up all its buildings with art installations. So not all of them follow this pattern where Stass's image and other images of famous artists with Leeds connections are going to be projected onto Leeds College of Art. Other buildings have purely creative, almost abstract images projected onto them, and others still have their own histories, and so people associated with those buildings will be projected onto those. But the whole city lights up, and this is really part of that.
And what was Stass' connection with Leeds?
Well, when he left Cyprus in 1953, he went first to London. At that time, he was not an artist. He was basically able to work as a waiter or a cook in restaurants, particularly Greek restaurants. And about the same time, my uncle, his brother Chris, started working in a restaurant in Leeds. So he said to my father, "Why don't you come up here and we'll work together in this restaurant." Now the restaurant, because of the fashion for all things Greek in those days, in the aftermath of films like Never on a Sunday and Zorba the Greek, the restaurant became very popular with trendy art students. So they started going there, and the lecturers started going there. And they saw some paintings that my father had done on the walls of the restaurant, just as decoration. I mean, he wasn't trained, he wasn't claiming to be an artist, it was just simple decoration. And they said to him, "Look, why don't you come and become an art student at the art college here?" And nobody really knows whether they meant it, but my father always thought they meant it, so he turned up. A man called Harry Thuber and said, "Of course you can become a student," and the rest is history, as they say.
And part of that history is his fame, if you like, of being one of the last people to be prosecuted for obscenity in the UK. Tell us about that.
Well, it's not prosecuted for obscenity, it's the last artist to be prosecuted for his paintings for obscenity. Under a very specific act, which was the Vagrancy Act of 1837, which even in 1966 was a pretty archaic act to get anyone under. It was the same act that was used against D.H. Lawrence, not for Lady Chatterley, that was the Obscene Publication Act, but for Lawrence's paintings. People tend to forget that Lawrence was first prosecuted for obscenity for being an artist, not a writer, and that was back in the 1920s. So Stass, in 1966, held an exhibition at the Leeds College of Art, as it happened, and the story goes that a school teacher was taking her pupils around the exhibition, and two girls were seen giggling at a painting showing a male nude in a state of excitement. The teacher was absolutely outraged, walked straight round the corner to the police station and asked for this painting to be taken off the walls, which the police duly did. So Stass was prosecuted really for giggling schoolgirls. And the interesting thing is, even at the time, the police didn't want to prosecute. They knew that in the middle of the 1960s this was going to look bad for them. And I have seen documents in the National Archives in England that show the police didn't want to prosecute. It was actually the Council Committee, which was called the Watch Committee in those days, that insisted on the prosecution. So that took place. But the thing that came out of that was that, I suppose, two things. First, Stass became an international celebrity. I mean, this made the newspapers and the art press all over the world.
Perfect spin in this day and age,
Absolutely,
wouldn't it be?
Yes,
Yeah.
and particularly, it's hard enough now, and it was just as hard then for an artist in a provincial town like Leeds to have international fame. So it was positive in that sense. But the other positive thing that came out of it was that Stass got to know major figures in the art world. People like Herbert Reed, Norbert Linton, Quentin Bell. These were major figures then, as they are now, and they all came to his defence. So in that way, it was a positive thing. But it has to be said, of course, that Stass's only experience of the police up until that point had been the British colonial police in Cyprus. So he was terrified. He thought awful things were going to happen to him.
Fortunately, they didn't in the end. He came back to Cyprus, he founded the art college here. But if people are in the Leeds area, what are the dates of this? It's basically a sonne lumière, I think, isn't it?
It is. The thing, for this particular part of the evening to make sure that they're in time for is basically 7 o'clock through till 10 o'clock. Leeds College of Art, which is right in the centre of Leeds, near the Civic Hall, which is the main council chamber. And they'll see music, they'll hear music, they'll see images being projected. As you rightly said, it's not just Stass's images, it's many famous artists who have been associated with Leeds College of Art over the years. So Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, Jacob Cramer, people like that. And it won't just be their own photographs that were projected, it will be images of their artwork, all synchronised with this specially composed work of music. But they should also wander around Leeds, because there'll be things going on all over the place. I mean, the whole of the city centre will be turned into this light show.
And that's the 3rd of October?
3rd of October, from 7 o'clock.
That's Michael Paraskos, son of Cypriot artist Stass Paraskos. Leeds it is then on the 3rd of October, if you'd like to take part in the annual Light Night Arts Festival.
Online and as a podcast, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
To mark the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the First World War, the University of Cyprus, the Goethe Institute and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung are organising an international conference on the First World War and Cyprus. One of the keynote speakers from the UK is Professor Robert Holland. Robert, I think the last time we spoke it was actually about your book on the Blue Water Empire, because you're very interested, aren't you, in the Eastern Mediterranean
Very much so.
and the role of the British as well. So that all comes into this World War business, I suppose.
Absolutely. So there's a chapter in my book on the First World War, quite a long chapter, and on the Second World War. And in both, obviously, Cyprus features in both of those chapters, though I suppose the key thing is, lucky Cyprus. In neither of the two world wars did it get fought over, invaded by foreign troops, or generally have a bloody awful time like so many other places did.
Malta, for example.
Which you think of the pictures of Malta being absolutely flattened in the Second World War. Didn't happen to Malta in the First World War. But nevertheless, of course, yes, Cyprus comes very much into my interest in that context.
And what about Cyprus' role in the First World War? We sent a lot of troops to both World Wars, but are you looking at the effect on the island or the contribution of Cyprus?
Well, I think this conference, there's a tension between talking about Cyprus and the war in some specific sense, and Cyprus during the war, which is obviously a looser, more general kind of subject. And I think the basic conclusion I would come to from my general knowledge, that Cyprus didn't do a great deal to the war, comparatively speaking, though there are many ways it did do, which we'll talk about perhaps, but the war did a good deal to Cyprus.
Like
it affected the economy very considerably. That's probably the most important thing. Cyprus, in many ways, had a good war. In fact, one official at the end of the war in London, comparing all the colonies and their experiences during the war, did make the point that Cyprus had benefited from the war. Always a slippery thing to say. But yes, the agricultural economy of Cyprus, and of course above all it was a farming economy, be it barley production, or be it tobacco production, be it olive production, cereal production, it increased remarkably between 1914 and 1918, and hundreds of thousands of tons of whatever you care to name in terms of Cyprus's agrarian production went, for example, to British armies in Egypt, in Salonika on the Macedonian front, to Allenby's armies in Palestine. And of course, the conference has several sessions, or one session certainly, on muleteers and mules and the pack transport, huge donkey farms outside Famagusta, and the mobility of the British armies, and the French army too, in Macedonia and in Palestine. The mobility would have been a lot less, probably, or not a lot less, but certainly to a degree less, without Cypriot pack animals. So in all those sorts of material ways, and there are other ones one could mention, Cyprus was significantly affected by the war.
And I know that this is about the First World War,
Yeah.
but that in-between wars period presumably was when the benefits were seen. But what effect did the role Cyprus played in the First World War have on its approach when the Second World War broke out?
That's a question I've got to think about rather quickly. Just to pick up one thing you did say earlier, when you said Cyprus sent troops to both the First and the Second World Wars, it didn't send troops to the First World War, if you mean fighting troops. The most significant contribution in personnel terms of Cyprus to the First World War was something like up to 15,000 muleteers, and of course thousands upon thousands of mules, not to mention goats, but 15,000 muleteers who went to serve as part of the Macedonian Mule Corps. These were not fighting troops. And indeed, one of the key kind of assumptions from the beginning of the war in London was that only a passive obligation would be expected from Cyprus. Well, in the end, it wasn't that passive, as I say, but it didn't include fighting troops. So this idea about putting guns in the hands of Cypriots was something that was not thought about. For a start, there had been intercommunal disturbances in 1912. There were various offerings of Greek Cypriot volunteer forces at the beginning of the war in 1914. As in so many colonial societies, or British colonial occupied societies, local forces, local leaders often wanted to offer help. It was a way, of course, of winning credit, of winning brownie points. And it was offered to set up a volunteer force, but to put guns into the hands of Greek Cypriots would have greatly frightened Turkish Cypriots. That was not going to be done. Of course, when it came to the Second World War, there was a slight difference. There was a Cypriot army corps that served in France, so there's a slight difference between the two world wars in that regard.
When you give your speech, you'll be talking, as we said, generally about Cyprus and her role in the Great War. Can you sum it up? What was its role, actually? I mean, you said it was a supplier.
Exactly.
But was there more to it than that?
Well, there were many material aspects to it. For example, Cyprus, there were major, large prisoner of war camps, meaning Turkish prisoners of war, because obviously it's most important that Britain and Turkey were at war. The British Empire was at war with Turkey after November 1914, and of course that's when Cyprus is annexed and the Ottoman connection is finally broken. So there was a prisoner of war camp, so it was important. There were two military hospitals in the early phases of the war, really to do with wounded from Gallipoli. Cyprus had a kind of outpost of the great sort of Eastern Mediterranean British Army intelligence operation that was so focused really on Athens, and the kind of key figure in that was this rather remarkable man many listeners will know a little bit about, Compton Mackenzie. So there's an intelligence aspect to Cyprus's role in the First World War, but there's not so much, and this is really go back to what I said earlier, and it relates to both wars. It didn't have a strategic aspect. The great strategic flux of the war really passed Cyprus by. There was a French proposal to use Cyprus as a base for an incursion into Alexandretta in 1917, but that actually never happened. So it didn't have a fighting role either in terms of sending troops or being used by the Allies and used by the British as a base on which to launch offensive operations. And so I think the basic significance of Cyprus at the time fits in with what I see anyway as being the general pattern from 1878 all the way through even to post-independence periods, even perhaps to, in some respects, to today. In other words, after 1878, it didn't become a strategic base, but it did have important supplementary assets in terms of military operations. It may be intelligence, it may be supplies, it may be all sorts of things. And so it has its material significance, but it is not a strategic fighting centre. That's why the British never built a huge, great big base on the island. Of course, they began to began to show some intention of doing so by the early 50s, but that was a passing phase because of the loss of other bases, and anyway it got cut short, of course, by the independence struggle. So well, important, but of course it's not Malta, it's not Egypt, and the Second World War, the First World War, and even more if you like the Second World War, was testimony to that, because Egypt is a great military base in the First World War. The British built a huge, great big base in Suez. It's worth remembering over Suez. But although the British occupied Suez in 1882, it doesn't become a base, a real big base, until 1916. And of course Malta is the great, if you like, the focus of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. Well, Cyprus isn't that. And one thought in my mind, looking back over the First World War, is if it had been different, if for whatever reason the British had built a big base in Cyprus, had, for example, used the First World War to do that, Cyprus had been used as a fighting centre, Cypriots had borne arms and fought with British armies wherever, in Salonika or in Palestine, in Egypt, wherever it might have been. The British presence in the island, the colonial identity of the island, if you like, would have become far more important. It would have become far more salient, far more embedded in the island. And that might have affected the later, wouldn't have stopped, of course, the movement for union with Greece, I don't think, but it would have changed the dynamics and the framework within which that was discussed, perhaps in a more, I don't know, what can one possibly say, a more moderate way, perhaps, where trade-offs might have been, in the end, politically come into play, and leading to, perhaps in the end, to a more stable transfer of power when independence did come. That never happened, and so Cyprus came out of the war. It came out of the war a British colony, more or less. It didn't formally become a colony until 1925, but in effect it came out of the war as a real British colony. But it didn't really come out of the war any more British than it had entered the war.
That's Professor Robert Holland, one of the keynote speakers at the International Conference on the First World War and Cyprus, that's taking place at the University of Cyprus Great Hall in the old campus in Gallipolios Street, Nicosia. It's happening on Friday evening and all day Saturday. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.